Mark Carney will meet Donald Trump on Tuesday, a highly anticipated event, as it's pretty much impossible to speak about Canadian politics without mentioning the U.S. president. Donald Trump has poked and prodded at our elected officials and aimed a tariff wrecking ball at our economy. And he recently told an American journalist that he runs not only his country, but the world. That reporter joins us now, Ashley Parker, staff writer at The Atlantic. Ashley, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
One of the things that really jumped out to me that he said to you and your colleague was that his first term was about trying to run the country and survive. His second term is about running the country and the world. What do you think he means by that?
In some ways, I think he means just that. His first term, he gets to Washington. The first office, it's hard to remember, but the first political office he ever sought was the presidency. So he doesn't know how the federal bureaucracy works. He doesn't know how the levers of power works. He doesn't know how the powers of the presidency work. He is surrounded by people who are not particularly loyal to him or to his agenda, at least not all of them. And he feels like from day one, he is just constantly under attack. Impeachments, legal issues, Democrats going after him, Republicans in Congress not doing what he wants to do. This time, when he returns to power, he has consolidated power in the Republican Party. There's almost no dissent from Republicans. These court cases, these felony charges are behind him. And he comes in surrounded by a different team of people who are willing to do essentially whatever he wants, however he wants. He understands the levers of power this time. He knows what he didn't know before. He sort of figured out the democratic norms. He's able to just utterly smash through. And he says, I run the world. I think a more accurate version of that is that he is sort of making the world bend to his will and or respond to his actions. And a classic example of that is simply tariffs. What Trump did with tariffs and the back and forth, there's just about no country in the world that is not paying attention or dealing with some ramifications or fallout or trying to figure out what a potential trade war with the United States and President Trump might mean.
Well, and of course, Canada is in the middle of that situation. Our newly elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is heading down on Tuesday to meet with Donald Trump. They seem to have a better relationship than Trump had with Trudeau, for sure. But I know that you spoke with Donald Trump about whether he's serious about these 51st state threats and the Canadian election and his influence on it. What did he tell you?
It was fascinating. You know, Donald Trump has been talking about Canada as a 51st state for a little while now, but it has always struck me and others who have covered him as sort of a troll and a provocation, but not something he's actually serious about. So it came up again in the Oval Office, and I believe it was Jeff Goldberg in this case, our editor-in-chief, who sort of said, but come on, surely you're not serious about Canada being a 51st state. And Trump said, no, I absolutely am. And Jeff pointed out that if Canada was a 51st state, it would essentially, by our standards, be a Democratic state, right? It would be a state that would likely send 2 Democratic senators and Democratic representatives and vote Democratic in the Electoral College and the popular vote. And Trump sort of said, I know, but, I just don't care. I want it to be a state. I will say he said this, but he didn't seem to say it as fervently as some of his other deep beliefs on, say, immigration and tariffs. And he also didn't offer any sort of plausible plan on how he plans to make that happen. And then the other interesting moment was we spoke to him shortly before the Canadian elections. Trump sort of gleefully said, once I became a president in the Canadian elections, I really turned it into a close call. I kind of threw it from the conservatives to the liberals. And again, that's not sort of his political ideology, but he seemed positively delighted at what he saw as the outsized influence he had in another country's elections.
Ashley, fascinating stuff. Thank you for joining us. Great article, a lot of insight, worth a read. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
How do Donald Trump's views like that affect Canada? Alasdair Roberts' book, The Adaptable Country, How Canada Can Survive the 21st Century, underlines Canada cannot be divided when it comes to fighting the U.S. president. Alasdair is in Washington lecturing on what he calls the broken republic and joins us now. Nice to see you, Alasdair.
A pleasure to be with you.
You talk in your book about this whole idea of the 51st state and Donald Trump. And one of the things that you say is that you don't believe he actually wants to annex Canada so much as you believe that he wants to weaken us socially and economically. Why do you believe that's the case versus a desire to take over, which is what he seems to keep expressing?
Because annexation or some sort of absorption would be politically very complicated. It would be administratively very complicated. It'd be very hard to work. I mean, the best outcome is a solution where Canada is sufficiently weak that it does everything that the U.S. needs to have done in terms of foreign policy, but the sort of domestic work is done by Canadian politicians. So I think that's the sort of the optimal outcome.
And when it comes to Canadian politicians, one of the things you've warned about is some of the division that we're seeing in Canada. We certainly saw it in the election. We saw, boomers versus millennials facing off. We saw rural versus urban. We saw big splits in the Canadian population. Why do you believe that Canadian politicians need to do more to come together rather than pull apart when we're facing Donald Trump and following years of his rule? It won't just be over in a couple of days. This is going to go on for at least 3.5 more years.
I think you're right. We're going to have more policy instability under this president. And it's also true we're going to have more policy instability, uncertainty about what's likely to happen, regardless of who the presidents are in coming years. I think the sort of fundamental reality is that policy instability, not knowing what comes next, is going to be something that Canadian politicians are going to have to deal with. But the other thing I want to flag is that there's a whole bunch of other challenges coming down the road, too. It's not just about Trump. It's about geopolitical changes elsewhere. It's about climate change, technological change. There's a lot coming down the pike that Canadian leaders have to sort of address in a systematic way. And I do worry that they're not they're not thinking about the problem that way. Everyone's focused on what do we do about Trump. But Trump's just part of the story.
What kind of risks does it create if you have a Canadian political system that's built around kind of this partisan nastiness versus actual policy debate?
Things can go sideways very quickly. Canada is a great but fragile enterprise. And if crises hit, if crises come one after the other, things can spin out of control very easily. So what you want to have is Canadian leaders on the same page about how they should be thinking about the future, and Canadian citizens thinking about the future, about being on the same page too, as best as we can be. And that involves thinking very deliberately about how we design institutions and design a public dialogue to get people thinking about the long run and coming together so far as we can with a shared understanding of how we're going to meet all of those challenges, and including Trump, but not just Trump.
We see Prime Minister Mark Carney headed down to Washington on Tuesday. If you could sit down and give him some advice on what he should be thinking about strategically as he heads into the Oval Office, what would you tell him?
I'm not sure I got advice on the personality, but I would say again, it's going to be thinking about how to satiate Trump, what can honorably be done in the short run. But I think at home, it's also about thinking about how to foster a conversation. Everyone is sort of aware of the challenges facing the country now. There's a sort of nationalist surge at the moment that will wear off in about a year. And at home, I think it's also necessary to sort of take the steps necessary to get people involved in a conversation about what the major challenges are. I think something like a reconfigured McDonald Commission from the 1980s, but something reconfigured for the 21st century would be a great way to have a national conversation about the generational challenges we're facing.
Great insights and wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alistair.
Thank you. My pleasure.